Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Brendan Long, ALP candidate for Murrumbidgee for the ACT election on 17 October. And it's my pleasure today to have the company of the federal member for Bean and former senator for the ACT, David Smith. Welcome, David, to our podcast today.
G'day, Brendan. Good to be with you.
Well, I'm going to let you give your spin on the budget. But first to say, as a brief introduction, my goodness, $213 billion of deficit, debt, $1 trillion. These are very big numbers. What do you think is the broad position of the ALP in terms of this budget? Is the fiscal, do you think the fiscal policy settings are basically right?
Brendan, I think it would be wrong to say that we don't think that we need to do something about jobs and jobs over the next year. It's going to be the big issue, and that there are particular challenges in youth employment. So you can actually understand to an extent where the government's coming from in terms of big parts of the budget that was delivered last night. But look, I think overall there's a couple of things that do need to be said, and one is, in fact, is working through the detail of what's being proposed and know what rigour has gone into the particular mechanisms that are going to be put forward before we know whether they're going to be effective. And it's pretty reasonable for us to be sceptical about some of the claims. So, for example, one of the great claims that's being put forward is that we may see 100,000 apprenticeships created in the next 12 months in a program that's going to have funding for 12 months. Now, on the face of it, that seems like a pretty positive announcement, but I guess there are a number of concerns for me, and particularly in my role on the Education Caucus Committee, and they include, well, what does this mean for, does TAFE have the capacity to support such training? We know that we lost $3 billion out of vocational education training over the last 7 years. Apprenticeships don't go for 1 year. So it's all very well to fund, or at least part fund, the commencement of apprenticeships, but what happens after that? We're not actually doing ourselves a long-term favour if we end up only funding the commencement and then having a lot of unfinished apprenticeships. And on an issue like that, the government's actually got a fair bit of form, because it was only 2 years ago, and a lot of people have short-term memories in this game, just as there are many who've got long-term memories, as you'd know too well. It's only in 2018, the then Turnbull government, I think we can still safely say it's part of the same government, maybe. They put forward a proposal for 300,000 apprenticeships, extra apprenticeships, they were going to create over 4 years. That program was going to cost $1.5 billion. Now, 2 years on, so, safely halfway through the duration of that program, what we've actually seen is the creation of maybe somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 additional apprenticeships places. So not a long way short of the 150,000 that you might expect. So I guess, some of the skepticism that's coming through today is these might be some of the right areas we need to work on, but this government has a bit of a tendency to overpromise and under-deliver. And we've seen it with some of the bushfire recovery funds. I think we've got one fund where $200 million was allocated to it. None of it's been used. Yeah. So look, interesting, but frightening levels of probably, I guess, speaking as a moderate member of caucus, fairly frightening levels of debt. And we've had the debt truck over the last decade, and there's been so much conversation around deficit, but we're seeing deficits into the foreseeable future on the basis of hopeful assumptions. So yeah, look, it's a really uh, bold in one sense budget, but there's still a lot unknown, and probably there's still a lot that's a lot of questions for us to ask. I think about how the programs are actually going to work. Is the Australian taxpayer going to get anywhere close to bang for their buck?
Yeah, that's there are points I agree with, David. Excuse me. Of course, we can't give Joshi Frydenberg, the treasurer, we can't give him credit for the labour market tax credit to stimulate apprenticeships. In fact, of course, this was developed by Peter Dawkins in a paper not long ago from Victoria University when he identified that we do have an emerging tsunami, if you like, an emerging plague of youth unemployment. So his idea was to shift the traditionally blue-collar apprenticeship program into a wider economy-based apprenticeship cadetship program, coming with the sort of funding that goes with all apprenticeships. So that obviously the government's taken on a little bit of that, but the Dawkins proposal was for a permanent change, not for an annual one-off change. So, I mean, here we're seeing, a bit more optics than substance by the government. And I agree with you that there is going to be significant challenges in taking on an apprentice. $200 is not a week, is not a lot for people under 30. And I also want to associate myself a little bit with the comments of Cassandra Goldie, who indicates that, there are a lot of people over the age of 35 who have been displaced from the labour market, and they matter too. And
Brendan, Brendan, just without wanting to jump in.
No, you go for it.
I was to say, and I've received a couple of emails from exactly those sorts of constituents who feel like they've been abandoned.
Yeah. So there are gaps here. I think. I mean, I agree with you that the fiscal policy settings are basically right, and the labour market proposal is good. In that sense, it's got elements of what I would see as a labour budget, but not quite enough. And it's not so much the volume of the deficit that I'm, contesting in any way. I'm not contesting that. I just think that some of the labour market programs offered may not be as effective as marketed. What about the tax cuts? What's your position? Where's the thinking on that, David?
Well, firstly, I might just respond to whether it's potentially has labour overtones or maybe undertones. I think there's an element of that, and let's face it. Even with what happened with JobKeeper, the government was dragged to proposals that really came out of the labour movement.
That's right.
But in the implementation of those proposals, we ended up with some perverse outcomes. And a good example of that was I spent a bit of time earlier today with some Qantas workers who, as you're probably well aware, are about to be outsourced. So effectively, Qantas has been happy to not only just pocket JobKeeper, but then almost in the next breath decide to outsource key parts of their business in a way which will undermine pay and working conditions. And I think one of the real fears actually about what's being proposed here too is that there are some really perverse incentives in that if I decide to hire someone that has been on JobSeeker and falls into the youth demographic, then there's a perverse incentive to hire them and possibly let go people who are not in that demographic. And I think one of the real concerns from a Labor perspective is depending on, this is where the detail of such schemes are really important, is where are the protections going to be to ensure that companies don't abuse such possibilities in the way that some companies have clearly taken advantage of the JobKeeper schemes as well too. I think that's a real deep fear because of particularly the practice of Qantas.
Sure.
But look,
No, I agree. They're
yeah,
real risks. What on the
tax cuts.
tax? I mean, Jim Chalmers has made some comments about stage 2 of the tax cut. I mean, where do you think? Do you think that these are going to have the effect that of stimulating consumption activity and so forth that the government hopes for?
Oh, look, I don't want to really cast a dampener here either, and I think we noticed that the stage 1 tax cuts didn't seem to have much of an impact at all,
Yeah.
And the stage 2, I guess, because of the overall environment we're in, it's probably harder to see them having that impact. So I think we obviously support stage 2, but and stage 3, it's just it's quite unlikely. It's really trying to assume behaviour despite many of the circumstances having changed in terms of the environment in which those tax cuts were initially going to be provided in. It makes it certainly could be a once in a lifetime budget here, Brendan, on both the cuts to revenue and the expansion of spending.
And revenue's fallen 55 billion, by the way. That's buried in one of the budget statements. But I like the look of a tax system where most of the population, the working population, has a top marginal rate. Most of them have a marginal rate of 30%, right? With a higher rate for those on higher incomes. Economically, I think that is a good outcome.
And it makes sense given what's happened with, I guess, the way much employment has been blurred with, dare I say it, people having the status of company taxpayers instead.
Sure. So that's right. You're sort of aligning the rates there, which has positive effects. However, I would suggest a little bit, and call me cynical, David, but as you know, I'm an academic, and us academics are trained cynics in some ways, and the tax cuts will effectively have, even though some of the withholding schedules will already reduce tax in the pay packets of some workers. For many, it will be when they lodge their tax return that they will get a nice bit.
And the time
will that be? Maybe sometime a couple of months before a federal election. So there might be a little bit of election timing going into the tax cut decision, I think.
You have punctured the romance of serious politics there, Brendan. It's but dare I say it, your views are probably shared by many.
A couple of quick ones now, because we don't want our viewers to be delayed with all of the thrilling details of budget policy. But there was about $155 million worth of extra infrastructure promised for the ACT in the budget. That's essentially good. I mean, the numbers are smaller than in other states, but look, any investment in infrastructure in the ACT is obviously a response to the Reserve Bank governor's call to borrow effectively to do infrastructure. So, I mean, those sort of developments, those sort of infrastructure spendings, I suppose, are welcome.
Absolutely. Look, I guess the only thing to be aware of is that the big component, which is really about the Molonglo Valley Bridge, the work on that, in a real sense, probably won't start till 2022. It's not even, we're obviously not near a finalised design phase, so won't. I think any attempt by, say, my good friend Zed Selja to suggest it's going to deliver jobs next year and to combat the pandemic, I think is probably a bit rich. And look, in relation to a couple of the smaller projects, there's a little bit that's I think a bit unclear. So it's where announcements, you want to probe a bit more into them. So some of it looks to me actually potentially like maybe it's just a bit of a cost blowout in terms of some of the improvements on the Monero Highway. It's not obvious that it's actually any new infrastructure spend there, but maybe a need for a bit more, a few more dollars to pay for it.
Yeah, so that would be a clever way to mask it anyway. But and just finally, perhaps, I will give the member for being the last word, of course. But finally, just as a Curtin resident, I just noticed that there has been 600,000 allocated for a plan for the diplomatic estate in Curtin Horse Paddocks. It seems to me that there might be potentially a little bit of conflict between state and federal, ACT Liberals and federal Liberals there. Do you have a view on that?
Or possibly their NBN connection broke down, Brendan. And if they're relying on Paul Fletcher's rollout, that wouldn't be surprising. Look, I think one of the real spin efforts by the local Liberals is pretending that in some way that this is a decision that they'll really be actively looking to reverse, knowing full well that the person who actually signed off on the land swap between West Basin and the Curtin Horse Paddocks was the Minister for Territories.
Yeah,
it was effective. Yeah, one of Zed's colleagues, and so it's. I think it would be. It's nice to suggest that maybe there's a bit of a disconnect, but I guess someone less generous would suggest that they probably knew that that this was the case, and that it wasn't really they're not really genuinely trying to put a different position forward at all.
Well, either way, I agree, but I think myself that just is not a good look for the Liberals to be a bit at sea on this issue, and it does affect residents in Curtin who have raised it with me. So, in any event, just to conclude our podcast, I always give the guests the last word. So, over to you, David.
Well, Brendan, I think what it plays to too is effectively the choice that ACT voters have, and the clear choice that they actually have in this election is they can support a team that's got pretty clear a clear record in terms of competence across all areas of government, and has a number of great candidates such as yourself who bring some real depth of expertise in such matters to a government team, with a team that quite frankly aren't even on the L plates. And this is an example where maybe they thought there were a few votes in it, but it's hard to take them seriously. So let's hope they don't have a role to play in the framing of the next federal budget either.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Brendan.